The chief executive of Ashcroft Industries pulled me out of a glass hallway on the 42nd floor and told me to stay away from her secretary. I am Nolan Pierce, a single father on a 6-month contract, and I assumed I had crossed some invisible line. What I did not understand was why the entire executive floor went silent, or why Marin Vale looked at me like she was holding a sentence behind her teeth. That night, Vivian Ashcroft set a folder in front of me and told me the truth. Marin was not a secretary, and my friendship with her had already cracked open a secret her family had buried. If you enjoy stories where arrogant people finally run out of words, subscribe and stay with me until the very last turn. My first morning at the Ashcroft Tower in Chicago, I understood exactly where I stood in the food chain before I ever reached my desk. The lobby was polished stone and cold light, and every person crossing it wore a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. I wore a pressed shirt and carried a leather case I had owned for 11 years, the corners worn soft from being set down on 1,000 different tables. My phone buzzed against my hip with a reminder I had set the night before, 3:15, pickup, and I silenced it before anyone could see the screen. I was 39 years old, restarting a career I had already built once and lost once, and I had made peace with the arithmetic of that. Peace, however, is not the same thing as invisibility. The job itself was unglamorous and enormous. Ashcroft was migrating 4 decades of corporate records, contracts, procurement files, board minutes, vendor agreements into a unified system, and somebody had to make sure that nothing arrived corrupted, duplicated, or quietly missing. That somebody was me, a contract systems analyst with a badge that said so in letters small enough to be an insult. It meant I could walk through rooms that most employees never entered, not because anyone trusted me, but because nobody considered me worth watching. I had spent 9 years running my own document digitization firm before a string of failed contracts closed it, and the one thing that experience gave me was a memory for how records behave. Files leave fingerprints. People forget that. The elevators were where I learned the shape of the building's hierarchy. There were public cars, and there was one bank reserved for executives and the floors above 38. And my access badge had been coded for the second because the archive rooms lived up there. On my third ride, a woman stepped in behind me wearing a cream coat and the kind of composure that money buys across generations. She looked at my badge the way a person reads an expiration date, then turned to the assistant beside her and asked, without lowering her voice, why temporary staff were using the executive elevator. I said I had authorization for the archive floor. She smiled at me pleasantly and asked me to step out anyway. I stepped out. There were 6 other people in that car, and not one of them said a word. That was my introduction to Celeste Wexford, chair of the executive committee and the most powerful voice on the Ashcroft board that did not carry the family name. She did not raise her voice, ever. She did not need to. Her contempt lived inside her courtesy, which made it almost impossible to answer without sounding like the unreasonable one, and I understood in that moment that this was a skill she had spent a lifetime refining. The doors were already closing when a hand caught them. A woman in a plain gray blouse and flat shoes held the car open and tilted her head at me, and when I hesitated, she raised her eyebrows like I was being slow. I got in. She pressed the button for 41 without asking where I was going, and when I mentioned the archive room, she told me I wanted the north corridor, not the south, because the south one had been resequenced in a renovation, and half the cabinets no longer matched their labels. She said it the way a person describes their own house. Her name was Marin Vale, executive secretary to the chief executive officer, and over the next 2 weeks, she quietly saved me somewhere around 40 hours of work. She knew which storage rooms had been consolidated and in what year. She knew that the 1998 vendor files had been split between 2 floors after a flood, and that the paper originals of anything before 1986 lived in a facility in Aurora, that nobody had inventoried since the last chief financial officer retired. Once, when I could not find a set of procurement binders, she thought for a moment, and then told me to check behind the fire panel in the eastern stairwell, and they were there, exactly there, coated in 11 years of dust. I laughed and asked whether she was a secretary or the person who had built the building. She did not laugh back right away. She looked at the row of cabinets for a second longer than the joke deserved, and told me that in certain places, if you want to survive, you learn every exit. Then she smiled and asked whether I wanted coffee, and the moment folded shut like it had never opened. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon, and I could not make it fit the woman who scheduled lunches and printed briefing packets. There were other small wrong notes. She kept her voice careful in meetings, and when the finance people started talking about tranches and voting thresholds, she would look politely lost, but her eyes moved with the numbers a half-second ahead of the explanation. She looked at certain board members the way you look at people whose bad habits you have known for years. And on her right hand she wore a plain old ring, the gold rubbed thin, with a small symbol cut into the face. A letter A inside a wreath of laurel. I noticed it because I had seen that same mark that morning, carved into the frame of the portrait of Gideon Ashcroft that hung outside the boardroom, the founder, dead 4 years, staring down at everyone who passed with the calm of a man who had already won. I did not ask about the ring. I told myself it was a coincidence, or a company gift, or 100 other things. But I had spent my working life noticing when 2 documents that should not match do, and something in me filed it away and refused to let it go. By the end of my 3rd week I had a routine. In at 7:40, 3 floors of cabinet work, lunch at my desk, out the door at 3:10 so I could be at the school gate by 3:40. My daughter Tessa was 10 and had opinions about everything, including my tie collection, which she described as a series of unfortunate decisions. Leaving on time made me a strange animal in that building. Twice I heard a director refer to me as the one who runs off, and once, passing the executive break area, I heard Celeste Wexford say to someone that Ashcroft used to hire men who built companies, and now apparently hired men who left meetings early for school pickup. I kept walking. I had learned over a long and expensive year that the only response those remarks deserve is the sound of you still doing your job. But I also started paying closer attention to the woman who said it, and to the enormous, orderly, humming machine of records that she and everyone above me assumed I was too small to actually read. Marin and I fell into a rhythm without ever deciding to. She handled Vivian Ashcroft's calendar and a portion of the executive document flow, which meant we crossed paths 4 or 5 times a day, in corridors and record rooms, and once in the freight elevator with a cart full of bankers' boxes. We talked about nothing important. She liked that I never performed for anyone with a title, and I liked that she never once used the phrase "you people," or referred to my contract as though it were a temporary condition of my character. She asked about Tessa, remembered the answers, and asked follow-up questions a week later that proved she had actually listened. It was not romance. I want that understood, because everyone who heard about it later assumed otherwise, and the assumption is what nearly destroyed me. It was the ordinary decency of 2 adults who found each other tolerable in a building where tolerance was rationed. She brought me coffee once when I was elbow-deep in a cabinet of 1991 shipping manifests. I brought her a bagel the day the board ran a 9-hour session, and she was still at her desk when I left at 3:10, and still there when I called back at 7 to ask about a file code. The afternoon that changed everything, she came around a corner with an armful of folders and a phone pinned under her chin and clipped the edge of a cart I was pushing. Paper went everywhere. We both dropped to the floor and started gathering, apologizing over each other, and I picked up a page that did not belong with the rest. It was old, heavier stock, the ink slightly feathered the way real ink feathers over decades. Near the bottom, I saw a signature I recognized from the wall outside the boardroom. Gideon Ashcroft in a tight, forward-leaning hand. Marin took it out of my fingers. Not roughly, but fast, faster than a person takes back a lunch order, and she slid it into the middle of the stack and stood up and thanked me, and was gone before I had straightened my back. I stood in that corridor with my hands full of ordinary paperwork and a very quiet alarm going off somewhere behind my ribs. Whatever that page was, it had not come from the calendar of a chief executive officer. It had come from somewhere else entirely, and she had not wanted me to read it. Above us, running the length of the 42nd floor, there is a glass corridor that connects the executive suite to the boardroom. Anyone standing in it can see down into the mezzanine where Marin and I had been kneeling on the carpet, and when I looked up, Vivian Ashcroft was standing there with a tablet in her hand, perfectly still. I had seen her 3 times in a month, always from a distance, always in motion, always with people arranging themselves around her like iron filings. She was 42, precise in a way that made precision look like a personality trait, and I had never once seen her expression change. It changed then. It was not anger exactly. It was the look of someone watching a small stone come loose from a wall. An hour later, my desk phone rang, and a voice I did not recognize told me the chief executive would see me now. Her office was on the corner, and she did not offer me a chair. She stood behind her desk with her fingertips resting on the surface and asked me, without preamble, how close I was to Marin Vale. I said we worked in overlapping areas and that she had helped me locate archive material. Vivian asked whether that was all. I said yes, and then, because the question had an edge on it that I did not like, I asked whether there was a policy at Ashcroft that prohibited 2 employees from speaking to each other. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, evenly, that whatever friendship I thought I was building with her secretary, I needed to end it. I felt the heat come up the back of my neck. I told her I had been in the building 22 days and had not once been late, missed a deliverable, or accessed a file outside my assignment, and that if she wanted to terminate a contractor, she did not need a reason, so she could simply say so. She did not blink. She said this was not a company rule. Then what is it? I asked. A warning, she said. She did not explain. She looked back down at her tablet, and the meeting was over, and I walked out through a reception area where 2 assistants suddenly found their monitors extremely interesting. In the elevator, I ran the conversation again and came to the only conclusion the evidence supported, which was the wrong one. I decided Vivian Ashcroft was either a woman who considered her staff to be property or a woman with a personal entanglement she did not want observed. Both explanations made her small. Neither of them was true, and I would spend the next 4 weeks being punished for the confidence with which I believed them. I did not sleep well that night. Tessa had a science project involving a volcano, baking soda, and a level of optimism I did not possess, and after she went to bed I sat at the kitchen table with a folder of my own, the boring one, the one with the mortgage and the health plan, and the number of months my contract had left. 5 months of stability after 14 months without it. I remember thinking that a man in my position does not get to be proud about being spoken to badly. I remember deciding to keep my head down. The next morning, I left my phone in the archive room on 41. I noticed at the elevator bank, went back, and stopped in the doorway because the lights on that side of the floor were off, and someone was standing at the desk Marin used when she worked down there. Celeste Wexford. She had a drawer open and a folder in her hand, and she was reading it with the unhurried attention of a woman who has never in her life been asked what she is doing. I must have made a sound. She turned, and I did the only thing I could think of, which was to walk toward the shelving as though I had come in for a file, and pull out a binder at random and say good evening. She watched me do it. She closed the drawer without any particular haste, tucked the folder under her arm, and told me in that warm and terrible voice that I was beginning to turn up in places that were not meant for me. Then she wished me a pleasant night and left, and I stood there holding a binder of 1989 freight schedules with my heart going like a hammer. The retaliation started 4 days later, and it started in a room full of people. We had a project status meeting every other Tuesday, about 20 directors and department heads around a table of dark wood, and my part was 6 minutes on migration progress. I had prepared a slide of exceptions, the ordinary garbage that any data migration produces: mismatched fields, duplicate identifiers, orphaned attachments. Buried in that list was a line item I had flagged because it was genuinely strange rather than merely messy. A cluster of vendor contracts carried execution dates from 6 years earlier, but the underlying file objects had not existed in any Ashcroft system until 3 years ago. I presented it as what I believed it was, a technical problem requiring verification. Preston Blackthorne, the general counsel, did not let me finish the sentence. He was 47, expensively assembled, and he spoke to me the way people speak to a waiter who has interrupted a story. "We hired you to move data," he said, "not to interpret it." I said that flagging inconsistencies was literally the definition of the audit portion of my contract. Celeste smiled down the table and observed that a technician should understand the difference between access and authority. I was told, in front of 19 people, to hold my remaining observations for my supervisor. I sat down. I want to be honest about that moment because I have replayed it many times. I was not brave. I was calculating the number of school fees between me and unemployment, and the calculation told me to be quiet. So I was quiet, and I watched the meeting move on, and I noticed that Preston Blackthorne wrote something down immediately after I stopped talking, which is not what people do when a subject is unimportant. Marin found me in the corridor afterward. She asked me what I had actually seen, and something in her voice had lost its softness. I explained the metadata problem in plain terms. When a document is created inside a system, the system stamps it. You can change what a page says. Changing what the system remembers about when the page arrived is a different problem, and most people who alter records never think about it, because the visible page is the only thing they have ever had to worry about. I told her 3 contracts showed a 6-year gap between their claimed signing and their earliest system trace. She asked me for the vendor names. I gave them: Meridian Freightways, Halloran Logistics Group, Colvin Terminal Services. She repeated them under her breath, and she did not look surprised. She looked like a person confirming a suspicion she had been carrying for a long time. And when I asked her why a secretary would care about supplier contracts, she said she had typed enough board minutes to be curious, which was the first time she ever lied to me, and we both knew it. 2 days later, I received an email from an address in the compliance office regarding unauthorized access to materials outside my assigned scope. Attached was a list of 9 file paths. I read it 3 times. Every single one of those 9 files had been assigned to me by the migration system itself, automatically as part of my queue. I had not gone looking for anything. The queue had handed them to me, which meant that whoever wrote that email either did not understand how the tool worked or understood it perfectly and expected that no one else did. That was the moment the temperature in my life changed. This was not contempt anymore. Somebody was building a file on me, and a file is not built for entertainment. It is built to be produced later, in a room, in front of people who will be asked to make a decision. I forwarded the email to my own records, printed a copy, and drove home in traffic I do not remember. That night, after Tessa went to bed, my phone rang with a number from the staffing agency that held my contract. The woman on the line was apologetic in the way people are when they have been told to be. She said the client had raised questions about scope compliance and that my engagement might be subject to review. I asked what that meant. She said she did not know yet. I said thank you and hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the mortgage statement and my daughter's field trip permission slip side by side, and for about 20 minutes, I seriously considered calling the agency back and asking to be reassigned to anything, anywhere, that was not the 42nd floor of a tower where powerful people had decided I was inconvenient. I did not call. I have thought about why. I think it was because I had already lost a business and swallowed the loss and told myself it was market conditions, and some part of me could not survive swallowing a second thing that was not my fault. The next morning I found Marin in the North Corridor and told her about the agency call. Her face did not move much, but her hand tightened on the folders she was holding. She told me I should listen to Vivienne. I said that I would happily listen to Vivienne if anyone in that building would tell me what I was supposed to be avoiding. She looked past me at the row of cabinets for a moment. Not what, she said. Who? Then she walked away, and I stood in a hallway full of 40 years of paper, understanding for the first time that I had not stumbled into a personality conflict. I had stumbled into the edge of something with a shape, and the shape had already noticed me. I decided to do what I had been told. For 6 days I avoided Marin Vale completely. I took the freight elevator, ate lunch in my car, routed every question about archive structure through a supervisor who answered half of them wrong. It felt cowardly and it felt sensible, and those two feelings do not cancel each other out. It also did not matter, because by then the decision had already been made somewhere above me, and my compliance was irrelevant to it. On a Thursday at 11 in the morning, Preston Blackthorne came down to the migration floor with 2 people from corporate security. He informed me, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that my system access was suspended pending an investigation into the unauthorized duplication of confidential material. Nobody touched me. Nobody grabbed my arm or marched me anywhere. It was worse than that because it was polite. A young man from security asked for my badge, held a scanner against it, and deactivated it in the middle of the lobby, while 11 people watched and pretended not to. Celeste Wexford happened to be crossing that lobby. She stopped near a column, close enough that her voice reached me without effort, and remarked to her companion that this was precisely why the company should not extend trust to people who are desperate for a paycheck. I felt something go white behind my eyes. I have a temper. I inherited it. I have worked on it for 2 decades, and I have learned that the only thing rage buys a man in my position is a story that other people get to tell about him afterward. So I turned to Preston and asked, calmly, to see the evidence. He said the matter was under review. I asked which files, on what dates, from which terminal. He said the matter was under review. I asked whether I was being accused of theft, because if I was, I would like that stated clearly, in writing, with a name attached to it. He smiled at me and told me that someone would be in touch with my agency. Then he walked away, and I picked up my case, and I started toward the doors with a decade of professional reputation coming apart quietly behind my ribs. My phone buzzed in the revolving door. Unknown number, 4 words, garage level 3, do not leave. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a full minute deciding. Then I went back in through the parking entrance and down 2 ramps, and at the far end of level 3 there was a service corridor and a small conference room I had never seen on any floor plan. A room with no glass, no nameplate, and a door that Vivienne Ashcroft locked behind me. Marin was already sitting at the table. Vivienne did not apologize and did not ease into it. She set 4 things down in front of me, one at a time, like a person dealing cards. A birth certificate from Cook County, 32 years old, with the mother's name filled in and the father's line completed in a later, different hand. A trust instrument, 16 pages, establishing a holding of voting stock to be released upon a named condition. A photograph of Gideon Ashcroft standing beside a woman I had never seen, both of them squinting into sunlight somewhere with water behind them. And a laboratory report, 4 years old, confirming a first-degree biological relationship between 2 coded samples. Her name is not Marin Vale, Vivienne said. I looked at Marin. She met my eyes and did not look away, and there was something in her expression that I recognized, because I had seen it in my own mirror during the year my business died. It was the exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a fact alone for a very long time. "She is Marin Ashcroft," Vivian said, "my sister." The room did a slow, quiet tilt. Gideon Ashcroft had a daughter outside his marriage. He never publicly acknowledged her, and by every account he was not a warm man about it, but in the last 2 years of his life he did 3 things. He met her. He confirmed the relationship privately, with a test that no one else knew existed. And he instructed an independent attorney in Springfield, outside the company's own legal department, to draft a trust placing a block of voting stock in Marin's name, releasable when and if she took a formal seat on the Ashcroft board. I asked how large a block. Vivian told me. I sat down without being invited. It was not a majority. It did not have to be. Ashcroft's control had rested for 9 years on a coalition, and the arithmetic of that coalition worked only because Celeste Wexford could reliably deliver the votes attached to 2 allied family blocks and her own committee chairmanship. Marin's stock, once activated, did not make her queen of anything. They made Celeste's coalition a minority by a margin of a little over 3%. 3%, in a room like that, is the difference between a woman who decides who belongs and a woman who is asked to explain herself. Vivian had known about her sister for 4 years. She had also known that the moment Marin appeared as an heir, every instrument connected to her would be attacked, delayed, litigated, and buried, and that Marin would be walking into a fight with a company she had never worked inside a day of her life. So Vivian had done something that was either brilliant or grotesque, depending on which chair you sat in. She had hired her sister as her own executive secretary under her mother's surname and let her spend 21 months learning the building from the inside, watching how the money actually moved before anyone knew what she was. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the corner office. So why warn me away from her? Vivian folded her hands. "Because Celeste does not know what Marin knows," she said, "but she now believes that you do." I turned it over. Celeste had seen us in the corridor together. Celeste had found me standing in an archive room at night, in a doorway she had not expected anyone to occupy. Celeste had heard me stand up in a meeting and describe out loud, in front of 19 directors, a timing discrepancy in 3 vendor contracts. From where she sat, I was not a contractor who had noticed a data error. I was Marin's friend, and Marin's friend had started reading exactly the records that would matter most. And there was one more layer which Vivian gave me last, because she was still deciding in real time how much to hand a man she barely knew. Marin had not come to Ashcroft only to claim her stock. She had come because in the 18 months after their father's death, while the estate was unsettled and the company was operating under interim authority, a significant volume of internal documentation had been amended. Voting agreements, supplier terms, committee charters. Nobody had been killed and nobody had been threatened. This was not that kind of story. It was the other kind, the kind where a chairwoman with excellent lawyers uses the disorder following a funeral to move a comma here and a signature block there until the structure that results looks exactly like the one that always existed. Marin spoke for the first time then. She said she had been looking for 2 years for a single document she could not explain away, and that she had never found one, because every alteration had been made by people who understood law and understood paper. Then she looked at me. She said, what she had not been able to find was somebody who understood systems. And I sat in a windowless room under a parking garage with my badge deactivated, my contract under review, my daughter's school fees due on the 9th, and finally understood the shape of the thing that had noticed me. I did not thank them for the explanation. I was angry, and I said so, which is not a thing I usually do in rooms containing chief executives. I told them that they had spent 2 years running a private operation inside a public company, and that when they needed a place to put the risk, it had landed on the one person in the building, without a family office, without a retainer attorney, and without a single unit of equity in anything. I told them I had a 10-year-old at home who thought her father had finally found a steady job. I asked whether either of them had considered, even once, what happens to a man like me when people like them start moving pieces. Vivienne did not defend herself. That surprised me more than anything else she had done. She said that if I wanted to walk out of the building that evening, she would personally ensure my contract was paid in full through its term, and that the access suspension was recorded as administrative rather than disciplinary, so that nothing would follow me into my next job. She said it without conditions and without a pause for me to consider what I owed her. It was the first moment I understood that the cold woman who had ordered me to end a friendship might not be the person I had decided she was. I stood up to leave. I had my hand on my case. And then, because I have never in my life been able to walk away from an unresolved inconsistency, I asked one question. The evidence Preston has, the download log, when was the record created? Marin slid a printout across the table. She had pulled it that morning, before anyone knew to stop her, because a secretary who has spent 21 months learning a building knows which reports run at 6 in the morning and who forgets to check who requested them. I sat back down and read it, and I read it again, and then I put my finger on a string of 11 characters at the end of the object identifier and asked them both whether they knew what that prefix meant. They did not, because there is no reason on earth a chief executive would. It is a housekeeping detail. When Ashcroft migrated to the new environment, every record imported from a legacy source was stamped with a source identifier so that we could trace lineage, resolve duplicates, and prove chain of custody during the transition. Records created natively in the new system carry one prefix. Records lifted from the old archive platform carry another. The prefix on the file that I had supposedly downloaded from my workstation belonged to the old archive platform. That platform was decommissioned 3 years ago. It has not accepted a new write operation since the week it was shut down, which meant that the log entry showing Nolan Pierce copying a confidential file was not a record of something I had done. It was an old record of something someone else had done, years earlier, pulled out of a legacy store, edited so that the user field read my name, and reinserted into the evidence chain by a person who had no idea that the system stamps its own memory. Nobody spoke for a moment. Vivienne asked the only question that mattered next. Who still has write access to the legacy store? 3 accounts, I told her, and I knew because I had spent my second week documenting exactly that, in a report that nobody had read. The chief executive's own administrative credential, which is why the answer had to be given carefully in front of her, the Director of Information Technology, and a standing credential belonging to the Office of the General Counsel retained during the migration so that legal holds could be applied to archived material. Preston Blackthorne's office. Marin made a small sound, not quite a laugh. I should say clearly that I did not break into anything. I did not write code, crack a password, or perform any of the theatrical nonsense that people imagine when they hear the word audit. I asked for permission, and Vivienne granted it in writing, on her own authority to examine the offline backup set held in the Aurora facility. It took 2 days. I worked in a room with concrete walls and a coffee machine from another decade. And Marin sat across from me with a legal pad, and I taught her to read lineage stamps the way you would teach anyone to read a bus schedule. We found the 3 vendor contracts first: Meridian, Halloran, Colvin. In the offline backup, taken 11 months before the migration, those contracts did not exist at all. Not in draft, not in a different folder, not under a different name. They appeared for the first time in a supplemental import performed during the estate period following Gideon Ashcroft's death, and then they were assigned execution dates 6 years prior to their own creation. Then we followed the money, which is the part nobody ever hides properly, because payments have to actually clear. Across 26 months, those three entities had received a combined total of a little over $41 million in freight consolidation and terminal handling fees. All three were incorporated in the same 8-week window. All three used the same registered agent, and all three had received their initial capitalization through an intermediary partnership whose limited partners included a fund managed by Wexford Capital Holdings. It was not a confession. I want to be precise about that, because I was precise about it at the time. Nothing we found proved that Celeste Wexford had personally ordered anything. What we had was a set of contracts that could not have been signed when they claimed, paid to companies that had not existed when the work was supposedly agreed, tracing back through 2 layers to an entity in which the chair of the executive committee held a beneficial interest that had never been disclosed to the board. That is not enough to convict anyone. It is more than enough to compel an independent audit, and an independent audit is the one thing in the corporate world that cannot be charmed, outranked, or asked to step out of an elevator. I remember Vivienne reading the summary I had assembled. She read it twice, all the way through, without a single question, which told me she was better at documents than she had ever let anyone see. Then she set it down and said we would need 3 weeks to prepare the presentation properly, with outside counsel, so that nothing could be dismissed as internal politics. We did not get 3 weeks, we got 9 days. Celeste Wexford did not know what we had, but she knew that something was being assembled, because women who survive 4 decades in rooms like that develop an instinct for the sound of preparation. On a Monday morning, she invoked a provision of the committee charter and called an emergency session of the board, and she framed it as a governance matter concerning the conduct of the chief executive officer. Her case was clean, and that is what made it dangerous. Vivienne Ashcroft had employed a close family member without disclosure. That family member had been engaged under a surname that was not the one on her trust instruments. Together they had granted an outside contractor under active investigation for data theft access to sensitive archival material. Every one of those statements was, in isolation, true. Assembled in order, they described a chief executive running a private scheme inside a public company, and if the board suspended Vivienne before Maren could take a seat, the stock would stay locked, the coalition would hold, and the audit would die in a subcommittee that Celeste chaired. They summoned me into the boardroom as an interested party, which is the corporate term for a man who is present so that he can be pointed at. I stood near the end of a table 26 feet long while Preston Blackthorne displayed the access log on the wall screen, and I watched 14 directors look at my name in a column and quietly decide who I was. Celeste did not shout. She looked at me almost kindly and told me not to confuse being permitted to sit at this table with belonging at it. When I began to explain that the log entry had been fabricated, Preston laughed and asked whether I was seriously suggesting that the legal department of a multi-billion-dollar corporation understood its own systems less well than a 6-month contractor. No, I said. I am suggesting that whoever altered it was counting on everyone in this room to think exactly the way you just did. That bought me 11 seconds of silence, and then Celeste spent it. She said that since the board's time was being consumed by claims about heirs and trusts, perhaps we should address the underlying fiction directly. And she put a document on the screen. It was a deed of renunciation, dated 8 years earlier, bearing Gideon Ashcroft's signature, in which he disclaimed any intent to convey stockholding interests to the individual named in a certain private trust, and directed that any such instrument be treated as void. If it was authentic, Maren had nothing. No stock, no seat, no leverage, and Vivienne had risked a company for a woman with no claim at all. I looked at Vivienne. She had gone perfectly still. Maren, Beside her had the face of someone who has just been handed a photograph of a room she has never entered, and I understood that neither of them had ever seen this page before in their lives. The vote to suspend was proposed and seconded, and I stood there looking at the screen, at a scanned page 8 years old, and at a small mark in the bottom right corner of the footer. I asked them to enlarge it. Nobody moved, so I said it again, louder, and Vivian told the technician to do it. The logo swelled across the wall, the letter A inside the laurel wreath, but a particular version of it, with the wreath opened at the top and the serif squared off. I asked the room whether anyone present remembered when that mark had come into use. 2 of the directors did, because they had voted on it. Ashcroft Industries had adopted that visual identity in a rebranding program approved 6 years ago. The document on the screen was dated 8 years ago. The mark on its footer had not existed for another 24 months after the day it was supposedly signed. Preston said, immediately and smoothly, that it was obviously a recent scan of an older original, and that scanning software applies letterhead templates all the time. I had expected that, because it is the only answer available. So I asked him to produce the archive watermark. Every document ingested into the old storage platform received a machine-applied identifier at ingestion, a string in the lower margin that could not be removed without destroying the file signature. Any genuine paper from 8 years ago that had ever lived in the Ashcroft archive would carry it. That page carried nothing. It had never been in the archive at all. Then I gave them the last piece, because a room like that requires you to stop being clever and start being boring. The scan header embedded in the file identified the device that produced it, a specific model of production scanner. I asked the chief financial officer to open the procurement records, live, on his own terminal, and read the purchase date of the first such unit acquired by Ashcroft Industries. He read it out. 3 years ago, in March. "Don't trust me," I said. "Trust your own purchasing files." Celeste Wexford lost her composure for the first time in my presence, and it was not dramatic. It was a 2-second delay before an answer, which in her case was an earthquake. She asked the board how it had come to weigh the word of a temporary employee against the officers of the company, and for once the sentence did not land, because nobody in that room was looking at me anymore. They were looking at the wall, where a forged page sat enlarged in front of 14 people who had almost voted on it. Marin stood up. She had brought the original trust instrument, the one their father had lodged with independent counsel in Springfield, along with the attorney's certification and a signature verification that Ashcroft's own legal department had produced 2 years earlier in an unrelated tax proceeding. Preston could not challenge the signature because his office had already authenticated it in a filing bearing his name. She stated her claim on the record. The stock released. The arithmetic in that room rearranged itself in the space of a single sentence, and the motion to suspend Vivian Ashcroft died without ever reaching a vote. Instead, the board voted, 13-1, to commission an independent forensic audit of the executive committee's vendor relationships and of the document alterations performed during the estate period. Afterward, I did not celebrate. I went down to 41 and started packing the personal things I kept in a drawer, because habits from a year of unemployment do not leave you quickly. Vivian found me there, in the same room where I had once stood holding a binder of freight schedules with my heart pounding. "You should have told me sooner," I said. She agreed, and then she told me the last true thing, the piece she had never intended to say out loud. 3 years ago, another auditor had begun asking questions about the Wexford supplier contracts. He was not harmed. Nobody in this story was ever harmed in that way. He was simply removed from his engagement, sued for breach of a confidentiality agreement, tied up for 19 months in a proceeding he could not afford, and made quietly unemployable in an industry with a very small number of employers. Vivienne had watched it happen. So when she looked down from a glass corridor and saw Celeste Wexford's attention settle on a contractor kneeling on a carpet next to her sister, she did the only thing she believed would work quickly, which was to be cold enough that I would obey her. "I was not warning you away from Marin because I doubted you," she said. "I was warning you because I know precisely what people like Celeste do to men who do not have our money." I told her that next time she might consider telling the truth before issuing the order. She laughed once, briefly, and it changed her whole face. The independent audit ran 14 weeks. It found undisclosed conflicts in 6 supplier agreements, unauthorized amendments to 4 internal governance records, fabricated evidence supporting a disciplinary matter against a contract employee, and, most damaging of all, that credentials belonging to the Office of the General Counsel had been used to write to a decommissioned archive on 11 separate occasions. Nobody was arrested. That is not how these things go, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Celeste Wexford stepped away from all committee positions pending resolution. Preston Blackthorne was suspended and then quietly separated. Outside counsel took custody of the records. I saw Celeste once more, in the lobby, near the same column. She still carried herself like a woman who had never been asked to leave anything. She asked me whether I imagined that one meeting had changed my position. "No," I said. She waited. "It changed yours." The elevator doors closed on her, and I want to be honest, it was the most satisfying 11 seconds of my professional life, and it made no sound at all. 6 weeks later, Marin returned to the company under her own name and declined an executive seat. She took a position on the Oversight and Ethics Committee instead, because she did not want authority handed to her by a surname, and I have never respected a decision more. Vivian offered me something permanent, Director of Records Integrity and Systems Compliance, with a salary that made me read the page twice. I asked whether the title came with executive elevator privileges. "Only if you stop talking to my secretary," she said. I looked past her. The desk outside her office was empty, and Marin was standing near the window with a new nameplate in her hand that read Marin Ashcroft, Board Oversight. "You don't have a secretary anymore," I said. "Exactly," Vivian answered. On my first day, in the new role, I left the building at 3:10, because that has never been negotiable. A newly promoted director tried to hold me for a briefing, and Vivian looked at the clock on the wall and told him that Mr. Pierce had somewhere more important to be. I rode down to the ground floor with a case I had owned for 11 years and drove across the city to a school gate where a 10-year-old with strong opinions about neckties was waiting for me. There was no limousine. I did not become wealthy. Nobody handed me a company. I got back the 3 things I had lost, which were steady work, a clean name, and a place where what I actually knew was finally worth something. Behind me, 42 floors of glass and dark wood were being rebuilt from the inside, by a room full of people who had been so certain of what a man is worth that they never once considered reading the records he was hired to carry.